Welcome to our latest Hippocratic Adventures chat, where we talk about everything related to practicing medicine abroad. I'm your host, Dr. Ashwini Bapat, and today I'm here with Dr. Erika Kokkinos. She's an emergency medicine physician, fairly fresh out of residency, actually just graduated in 2022. She's a first-generation Greek American currently living and practicing in Wales. So before we get started, smash that subscribe button, sit back and enjoy. So Erika, thank you so much for joining us. I know we've had kind of back and forth on Facebook for a while now, so I'm so glad you're here and here to share your story.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I know it's tricky. It's a blessing and a curse of the European lifestyle here, where you've got kind of loads of free time and then you plan a bunch of travel. So I think we just kept mismatching our schedules, but glad it worked out.
I'm glad you're here. So, let's get to it. You actually just graduated residency in 2022, and then you moved to Wales, and currently you are in Wales. So tell me kind of what was your thinking coming out of residency, and what prompted you to move to Wales, and how did you actually approach that?
So I had some pretty amazing mentors in residency who, just kept telling me, you need to find what it is outside of clinical medicine. What is your thing, right? So, because I would ask, after shift and sleep deprivation, I was just like, burnout is inevitable. I love the job, but I just know, I can see the future and I can see it sort of not so far in the future. And I was worried that it was inevitable. And so I was just like, what do you do? Like, how can you keep showing up to work? And they were just like, you've got to find your thing. So I had, mentors in ultrasound. I had mentors in wilderness medicine. I had mentors in medical education. Like, I sort of had a lot of different things that I was interested in, but not any one thing made me feel like, yeah, this is my niche. Not that everyone needs a niche, but this is my outside of clinical medicine, what's going to kind of keep me going in the job. So I was really nervous about that because I felt like all my colleagues were applying to fellowship. They knew what their thing was. They were applying to jobs based on location, based on their partners or whatever it was. And my partner and I we couldn't really figure it out. And nor did we really feel the need to straight away. I was like, surely you don't just like go from residency into your dream job. So basically, I kind of took my interest in wilderness medicine and thought maybe I can put that to work elsewhere, and started looking around internationally at opportunities. Are there volunteer gigs abroad or just ways that I can put that interest to work? And I came across a blog called Adventure Medic, which in the States, I don't know if you've heard of it. I mean, in the States, I feel like not a lot of people heard of it. They were like, is that is that a legit blog? Here, it's like everyone follows it.
Oh.
So it's kind of interesting. At least all the doctors in my area follow it. And there was a job posting to work in the heart of kind of Snowdonia National Park, which at the time sounded made up. This is like a magical fake place, which it's a national park in Wales. And this hospital is at the base of the national park and also magically happens to be right near the ocean as well, which is how do you get those two together? So it was sort of ideal. So the job posting was hiring for like a start date within like 6 months or something. And I reached out to them, I think my third year of residency. And I was like, hey, in the States, you kind of have to know what you're doing like a year out-ish, or, like leading into that. And, this whole like 6 months or less in advance isn't going to work for me. they're like, okay, sure. So they like opened the posting. I applied for it. They interviewed me. And then I knew within like 2 weeks or something that I was going to Wales after graduation, um, which opened a whole can of worms for my residency director, but we can get into that later. So yeah, I mean, and at the time, I mean, my husband, I was like, hey, do you want to move to Wales next year? And he was like, sure. Where's that? And like he looked it up and stuff, and he was like, yeah, that looks awesome. And we had no idea what we were in for. So that's sort of how we ended up here.
I love that story. I love how your husband had no idea where Wales was in the first place. So I actually want to go back to something that you said. You said that after you graduate residency, it's not like you're going to find your dream job immediately. Can you speak to that? Because I actually think that is the expectation that a lot of residents and interns, I remember when I was a resident, the expectation was that you would find kind of this job that you'd like enough to stay for a while and potentially like stay in this job and like retire, because that's what all of the colleagues, mentors we had that's what they did. So I actually want to hear about where that came from, because that's different than what I think most people hear.
Um, yeah, I guess I think in a perfect world that would be the situation, but so I wasn't I didn't I'm like a second career doctor, I guess. Not that I had like an incredibly long career beforehand, but I was in a different field. Um, so I was in I actually studied radio, television, and film in undergrad, and then worked in video production and like wanted to be an actress kind of thing, like straight out of college. And so it was pretty apparent to me from that kind of time in my life that many jobs look perfect on paper, and especially when they have a salary attached, they sound perfect. And then, the reality sets in a few months in, and then you start getting a little selfish and you start thinking like, this is not actually my ideal, and how do I find that? And so I just figured it would be the same with medicine. I think one thing that my cohort of, and I are realizing after graduation is, in residency, you put your head down and you do the work, and you are so consumed with learning the medicine that it's hard to actually spend the time to figure out what you prefer about the site you're at. I trained in 3 different hospitals, and while I can say at the time that I had preferences as to where I liked working, I don't know that I could actually articulate what it was that I liked about the different sites and why. Whereas now, I feel like I actually have the brain space to think, you know what, I think I actually do kind of like a smaller hospital, or I like, maybe I want a trauma center or something. I like, you actually have space to think about what you want on your day-to-day, in your day-to-day, as opposed to just what you are not forced into, but what the environment is that you are in. I feel like you're so like thrilled to even just match into residency that you're just like, I'll take anything I can get. It doesn't matter. And then, when like real life actually happens outside of residency, you can get a little selfish, and you can say like, I don't see myself working here for the next 10 years. So what is it that I want that looks different? And I think that maybe came in from, like I said, my prior job, and just sort of knowing that like straight out of college, I wasn't the happiest in my first job, and I needed to figure out why and what I was looking for.
I think that's wonderful. I think that is a unique perspective that you brought into your medical career. And I think that's just a more reasonable expectation to have, to know that, it's true. Like once you graduate from residency or fellowship, you have a lot more space and time to actually think about what kind of practice do you want. And maybe you're going to have to try out a couple different positions to figure out which aspects you like. So I love that. I also love the other thing that you did, which was you applied to that position and you reached out to them, even though I guess they were looking for someone to start in 6 months, and that wasn't going to be you, obviously, because you were still in residency. So I love that you reached out to them anyways.
Yeah, I just kind of figured like, people were making huge decisions, like where they would end up in the country and, what, looking over contracts and stuff. And I felt like I kind of needed to know if this was going to be an option or not. Otherwise, I needed to go down a really different, path or continue my random Google searching for international opportunities. So yeah, I figured it was worth reaching out. They were like really tickled. They were just like, how did you find us? Like, we don't get like American applicants. And, they were just like really thrown off. And I remember speaking to them and them just kind of laughing throughout like certain things I was saying. And I was like, I'm really sorry to interrupt, but like, what are you giggling at? And they were just like, you just keep saying things we don't say. Like, I think I said epinephrine or something. And they were just like, yeah, it's adrenaline and it's all right. We'll work on it and stuff. So they were like really warm from the get-go about just like this random American that reached out to them.
Wonderful. And so then what was that process like of getting registered in the UK to actually then practice?
So I would say in retrospect, it was actually, I made it far more a big deal than it needed to be. And I think I was just so terrified of it going wrong. And then me having to kind of scramble for like a last minute, now what do we do? But it was actually kind of, I don't want to say straightforward, but like I said, I think in retrospect, I complicated it. So what I ended up doing was I started putting feelers out to people saying like, hey, have you ever met someone that registered in the UK to practice? And like someone at work overheard me talking about it and kind of poked their head around and was like, I know someone that did that. And I was like, oh, thank God I have a loud mouth because someone somewhere heard that I need, that I'm looking for this, and I very much like didn't keep it to myself because I was just like, I need help and I don't want to mess this up. And so a colleague, an attending that I was, like I said, roundabout working with, put me in touch with someone she knew that actually did something similar to what I'm doing, kind of moved to the UK for what they call a fellowship, although we can get into that. It's not a fellowship, but anyways, moved to the UK for a year, did that, moved back to the US, but in the meantime had met now her husband. So then moved back to the US and then ended up she's now in London practicing. So I had spoken to her about the GMC, the Graduate Medical Council, or excuse me, General Medical Council process. So I had some insight, she was like, these are going to be the hiccups. This is going to be the part that feels overwhelming or something, but it's okay. There's a way around it. Or this, like you just need to keep submitting documents. So a lot of it is providing evidence, and they keep using the word evidence, which makes it feel very much like this like weird criminal investigation and stuff. And so I just felt like everything was being like fine-tooth looked through, and I was like, I don't have the right evidence. And ultimately, they can't say a whole lot via email as to whether or not you're meeting criteria as you go. And so you're submitting this stuff without a lot of feedback to know you're on the right path. But if you get on the phone with them, they're a lot more sort of like warm about it. And they're like, we help people do this all the time. And then you find out that they're not actually trying to like work against you and use this evidence in a weird way. It's just, they just need a bunch of documents. And then once I finally submitted it all, there was a little bit of back and forth. Like, can you show that you have more time doing blank, like for example, like surgical experience or, and I really was worried about that because their training here, they do a lot of surgical training kind of before they go into their full their version of residency and stuff. So I'm sitting here panicking that I won't have that experience. And then ultimately it was fine. So basically, as long as I just kept providing what they asked for and getting, if I didn't have this specific experience, essentially asking my residency director to write a letter saying, no, we don't particularly spend like 6 months in operating rooms, but we do this, this, and this. And yes, she is fluent in English and things like that. And then ultimately it ended up being fine. But in the meantime, I was like pulling my hair out that I don't have all this evidence that they're looking for, and it was all going to be like for nothing, and it was fine.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Partially because I'm going through a very similar process in Portugal, actually, and
Okay.
I'm having a very similar back and forth around some of their medical requirements, and it does mean I have to keep going back to my residency program and being like, hey, can you write a letter that says this statement or something?
Right. And I think if you kind of remember that the person on the other end of the email isn't necessarily medical, so they're literally trying to capture this very specific tick box sort of thing before submitting the whole package to someone to review. So it's not as though they've reviewed it and they're like, this isn't quite what we're looking for. They're just trying to make sure your application's complete. And I think once you kind of like settle down and realize that part of things, then it's more it's just sort of the process, not like a stressful interrogation.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And so
good luck with that.
thank you.
It'll be fine.
I will need it, because it is like that. It's like it is a little stressful because, and you're right, I do have to step back and be like, you know what, they're just trying to check their boxes before they literally have someone read this stack of documents that I've sent over to them. So what are you doing in Wales right now? And what is that like compared to how you were practicing emergency medicine in the US?
Yeah, so the role that I took kind of last year when we moved here is called a clinical fellow.
Okay.
And it was a clinical fellow in medical education. Now, their clinical fellow role is very different than a fellowship in the US. Usually, clinical fellows are not actually done with training. They're sort of dabbling in things, right? So it's actually a year to try out more or kind of get more exposure in medical education, let's say. Like, for example, I could do a PG cert, so post-grad certification, so not quite a master's in medical education. Or, there are some people that do a lot of research with this year. A lot of my colleagues are doing pre-hospital emergency medicine, and they're doing a clinical fellow role in FEM. So it is not like the equivalent of an American fellowship in medical education. So last year, what I did was I was full-time, but I did 50% clinical work in the emergency department and then 50% medical education. And it was very much dictated by what my interests were. So I did some ultrasound teaching. I did some sim for junior doctors. I did lots of lectures for them, basically just kind of, I like teaching. And so I did more of that. And then they funded, thankfully they kind of, had a decent budget for me to go to conferences to learn more about teaching ultrasound and to learn more about like the educational theory behind sim and how to actually do effective sim. So things like that were kind of what consumed my last year. And then as of August, I continued on basically just 50% clinical, with the thought being that with the other 50% of the time, I wanted to make sure that we enjoyed the place that we are in and had plenty of time to travel and see things and not feel like I always needed to be in the same spot for work. And then I also have tried to be in the process of doing some locums work back home as well, feeling like I need to maintain my license in both countries. Because it's pretty amazing how quickly you feel like you adapt to one system and lose part of the other. So that's what I'm doing right now. I am not I guess what you would call an attending back home. I'm a registrar, which is right below an attending, or a consultant, as they call them here. For me to apply to be a consultant, or to fill that role, my hospital, my department is amazing and really supportive of that, but I would have to kind of jump through some loopholes, or not loopholes, excuse me, that sounds sketchy, some hoops, to obtain that licensing. Partly because when I first applied for this role and to apply to practice here, I just didn't apply at that level because I didn't need to. So I applied just the level below. And then, so to kind of prove to the GMC that I'm ready to practice as a consultant would just require a bit more time and, paper gathering and yada, yada, which the department is really supportive of. It's just a matter of if we want to stay long enough for that to be worthwhile.
That's awesome. And so for anyone that's listening that is interested in GMC registration in the UK and how you actually practice there, we do have a blog that outlines that process. So I will link to that in the comments below. And so what are some of the differences you noted in I would say, the clinical practice of medicine? It sounds like epinephrine is called adrenaline and things like that. Is it more along the lines of kind of the lingo that they use, or?
Certainly lingo. I think one thing that I didn't really appreciate. So many people, listening to this are probably like, what, you're not an attending? Like, forget that. I'm not going to go from being an attending to not. I will say my first weekend in the country, I think it was, or the second weekend that I was on nights, and I've never been more thankful to have someone senior to call. When you're in a new country, without knowing the system and without knowing kind of how things are done here, and then you have a bunch of junior doctors looking to you for answers, it's quite overwhelming and quite you're worried about doing the wrong thing for the patient, and that's like the worst. You don't want to be in that position. So I would say, if you can put your pride aside and sort of accept maybe a more junior role, I think it's worthwhile to learn how things are done here. For example, in my orientation to the hospital, they kept referring to a news score, if a patient has a high news, then you want to alert someone. And I'm just sitting here writing down okay, I'm going to Google that later. There is no introduction. There are kind of webinars through the GMC. There are things about introduction to working in the UK. But I would say that's for general medical, how to kind of work within a hospital system. They don't tell you about the things you didn't realize you're not going to know about coming to the system or coming into the country. So a news score is a national early warning score. It's essentially their prediction for someone that's going to deteriorate. And this is something that I throw around now regularly, but in orientation, I'm just I need to Google this. That is an embarrassing thing to come in and not know, and to have junior doctors be like, well, you don't use a news, what do you use? So there's things that you just don't know until you get there. Or finding out that sort of how the satellite hospitals work, or because it is socialized medicine, there's throughout all of Britain, things are done fairly similarly. So everyone that's trained in the system knows how these things are done. And that's just second nature to them. And I just didn't know, if you, for example, just not knowing what some of the phrases are. Cody is care of the elderly, and it's just a standard, that's your geriatrics, and so things like that get thrown around so regularly that I felt for the first 3 months I was just learning not just new lingo, but also the new system, and how things work here. the look on anesthesia's face, first of all, it's anesthetics, not anesthesia, but the look on their face when they asked me if we have any metaraminol, and I was like, what? Can you spell that? Like metaraminol is their vasopressor of choice in the resus room, in the ED, it's a peripheral vasoconstrictor. So I was just like, I need to learn a lot for people to take me seriously, because otherwise they're going to think like there's so much allowance for, oh, she's new and she's American. And then there's the like concern that they might think I just don't actually know medicine. As long as I like can make sure that they know I'm competent, it's just a system change, then, I felt at ease. So yeah, so I would say there was huge adjustments to the different clinical environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that depending on what country you move to, they use different medications. They have different names for them. Their brand names are different. What's available is different. And honestly, everyone that I've talked to that moved to the UK did start off as a registrar, simply to learn about the system. And they may have been in practice for like 10, 20 years, but they started as registrars, and then later they applied for that consultant position. But it was for a very similar reason, in that they needed to learn the system that was completely new to them. And eventually over time, they did learn, right? The way that you're learning. And so what has it been like to actually live in Wales? What are some of the joys and challenges? And I think it's important to talk about both, because I think that is the reality when it comes to living abroad. Has this conversation got you thinking about starting your own adventure? Then you're going to want to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, where we talk about everything related to practicing medicine abroad. And when you sign up, you're also going to get our free ebook called How to Start Your Adventure. You can go to hippocraticadventures.com and hit subscribe.
Yeah. So, my husband and I often joke that we feel like we're living on the edge of the world. The weather here is very, I won't say unique, because I'm sure there are other places like it, but it was just very new for us. So I had spent some time in Scotland when I was in undergrad, but that was like over 15 years ago. And so I remember it being cloudy and rainy. I had been there in the fall, and so I knew to expect that. And I'm from Michigan, so cloudy and rainy is not something I'm not unfamiliar with. But here, being on the edge of an island, I mean, even last night, we had 55-mile-an-hour winds. And I was joking, like between the rain kind of coming sideways and the wind, I was like, I feel like our house is going through a car wash. Like it just felt like everything was shaking. And I was like, I think we'll come out like cleaner on the other side, but we might not have a roof. I'm not sure. So it's very unique in that sense, where for a few days it might do that. And then like the sun will come out and it's just the most glorious, like beautiful, like sun shining in the mountains kind of day. So weather wise is it's not for the faint of heart. We've certainly gotten stuck in weather in the mountains that we weren't expecting, or we were expecting but we're hoping to like beat, and things like that. It's just sort of a different landscape than what we were used to in Michigan. I would say one of the huge joys for me is being like 10 minutes that way into the mountains, 10 minutes this way to the beach. And I like there's a culture of like swimming year round here.
Wow.
And so I've certainly embraced that with like I think our first jump in a lake was in like November, but maybe my scariest one was the one in February.
Wow.
So there's swimming year round. You can wear a wetsuit, but you get judged a little bit. So it's just like, yeah, it's a wild, like everyone just like embraces the weather. And tons of rock climbing, which I actually don't rock climb. I just mainly hike, but you know, there will be like a maybe 3-hour window of sun or something. And the messages on WhatsApp are like, boom, we're going climbing during, you know, like they're really intense about like getting out there and embracing like the good weather while it's there. And then when it's not good weather, doing other things like I mean, most people will cycle or run in any weather or swim and stuff, but you know, just trying to keep it a little more tame. So I would say the joys are certainly the exposure to just like our outdoor interests. And I also just like, I really like kind of having people tell us about their, oh, have you done this? Have you done this peak yet, or this climb or this hike or whatever and stuff? And then we'll like put it on our list. So like ticking off our little kind of things we've got to do while we're here. And then I would say another huge joy for me is like my colleagues at the hospital are a lot of the doctors there are from all over, many from England, many from like Egypt, Pakistan, you know, just sort of international. But like most of the nursing staff and most of the kind of support staff are Welsh. And I've been like slowly but surely learning Welsh and trying to pick up on helpful phrases to speak to my elderly patients who, you know, I was just really surprised how much Welsh is spoken here. It really is a really cool language and just culture, proud, you know, like awesome people that live here. So I would say those are kind of some of the joys, but it's certainly not without its challenges. I mean, I think even recently running into some issues like with our, we have a camper van and like running into issues with having to do some repairs on that. And then, you know, things that like would come fairly easily to us in the States because we just know where to go and what to do. Everything just feels like it is a little more challenging here because we just don't know how to go about it. And then even once you do, the hours are specific or they are off on holiday or, you know, very like, we're used to the American, like everything is open and available to us all the time. And we don't have that here. And so there are definitely some times where my husband and I are just like, gosh, this is hard. And it feels like it doesn't need to be, but it is. And, you know, there's been plenty of times where I've just been like, oh, I just want to be back in Michigan where I know how things are done. And I just like feel like comfortable. And, you know, we haven't picked up and moved back just yet because of, you know, hiccups like that. But listening to that and kind of acknowledging that that is a very real struggle when you move away from everything you know, and deciding if it's worth it or not, I think is sort of an ongoing discussion that we're having is, you know, at what point do we actually feel like this is our new normal versus just something we're putting up with when we come up to those challenges? Like, yeah, so things like that. I will say we're both really close to our families and we've had a lot of family visits, which has been awesome. Also makes it, again, sort of hard where you're thinking, why am I away from them? You know, so yeah, it's definitely not all joys as much as I want to pretend that it was like you know, it's sunshine and rainbows and butterflies here. There's definitely struggles with moving abroad.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that because I don't think we spend enough time actually talking about that aspect. And I just the other day, you know, I told you I'm going through the medical licensure process, and I had to explain to them that our medical school is 4 years, and in Portugal it's usually 6 years. And that before these 4 years, though, we do 4 years of like a bachelor's in something in whatever area. And they just weren't like hearing it. They weren't understanding. And I just had a moment where I was like, why am I doing this? I'm like, I'm a fully licensed attending in the US. I could be like working pretty darn easily. I wouldn't have to try to learn a new language, try to go through their licensure process. Why am I doing this? And then I have moments like that when, for example, earlier this year, our sink broke down, our kitchen sink, and it was leaking. And so we needed a plumber. The plumbers were not available for like 3 months.
Yeah.
And or they would say like, oh yes, I'm coming today, and then they never show up. And I'd be like, oh my God, when is our kitchen sink gonna actually work? And in these moments, I'm like, you know what, if I was in the US, we'd have a plumber here in like 2 hours, they would fix the thing and our kitchen sink would be working. But instead, I think it took about 3 months to actually get it to work. And I know this licensure process is going to take a while. It's going to be a back and forth, kind of like what you described. And absolutely, in those moments, I'm like, why? What am I doing? Like, why am I here? Why have I made my life so much harder? And then I think for me, it kind of like balances out with the joys you speak of. Those everything is new here, right? Like when someone says, oh, have you been here? Have you checked out this festival? I'm like, nope, I definitely have not. And I'm adding that I have a list too. So I think that it's important that we actually talk about both aspects of what it's actually like to live here, or to live in Wales or wherever it is that you're moving. So I guess that actually feeds into one of my rapid fire questions. We'll kind of switch into that. One of my rapid fire questions that I thought would be cool to ask is, you know, in this process of you moving to Wales, what's one thing you've learned about yourself?
Ooh.
Or it could be a couple of things you've learned about yourself.
I'm trying to think how personal to get with this.
Whatever you're comfortable with, honestly, like whatever comes to kind of the top of your mind.
Yeah. So I think I'm actually possibly trigger warning or something. I don't know. I'm going to get pretty personal because when you and I were first in discussion and you were like, hey, do you want to write a blog post or something? I started one, and the first things that came out were incredibly personal. And I was like, ooh, I don't know if I should go down that route. And I think it's I think I'm just going to share it. So one thing I've learned about myself is I am almost like dangerously capable of handling adversity. And I say that because I think so when we first moved here, we were unable to get housing. It's really challenging to get somewhere to rent, like if you're not in the country. You can have realtors working for you, but they might not always take you that seriously, like until you're there and showing them, anyway. So on top of that, we have a dog that we moved with us. And so getting somewhere to rent to someone that allows pets is really challenging. So we had nowhere to live. So we showed up on a farm that I had found on the internet, and I was drawn to it because they had goats on the farm. It was like a campground farm. They had goats and a goat trampoline. And I was like, I need to stay at this place that has a goat trampoline. Like, what an awesome place. So we showed up there in the middle of the night. The owner actually came and picked us up from the ferry port because we couldn't get a taxi or anything in the middle of the night, and everything had been delayed. We got there. We were going to stay in this tiny pod, me, my husband, and our dog, with like 5 suitcases. And I was pregnant and we had nowhere to stay. And I was just like, we're going to live in this pod until we find somewhere to live. And then I'll try and advance through this all. So we ended up buying a camper van, living in the camper van, often staying on the farm that sort of adopted us as these amazing, they were just such warm people, often staying in the hospital parking lot until colleagues and the farm people ended up finding us a place to live, where the day before we were about to move in, finally having a home, I had a miscarriage. And then days after that, we had to fly to Greece to a wedding where I was going to then announce to my whole family that I was pregnant. And so then came back and basically living in this place that wasn't ideal, but it worked. And then trying to ask around, like, can we get somewhere else to live? And then moving again to another place, all with this camper van and this dog and this new country and this new work and this medical issue that had ongoing complications. And even just like saying all of that all happened in the first like 3 months. And it just sometimes, like, when I like verbalize all that, people are just like, are you okay? Like, what have you done? You're like, this is a lot. And I'm like, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And it was really hard. And I'm really grateful that my husband is incredibly supportive and that my family was incredibly supportive, even though they couldn't be right here. And these new colleagues and like essentially like local family helped us through all this, because it's enough to up and move to a new country. But then to have all those things occur and these like just not knowing where you're going to live. I mean, come on, that's enough to throw anyone, so to tack all this stuff on, I'm like, wow, I don't know how I've done it, but I guess I'm pretty resilient and I'm really thankful for that. I probably didn't have to go through all that to figure that out. I wish I didn't have to have, I wish I hadn't gone through all that. But you know what? Like, I did, and I am, and I continue to kind of work through it. So I think I've learned that about myself. And now when it comes to like, you're talking about kind of proving stuff to the medical counselor, things like that, I'm sort of like, oh, it's a lot of faff, but I guess I've been through a lot, so I can tolerate it. I can deal with it.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, because I think the amount that you dealt with in the first 3 months, just starting with not having housing and then kind of the miscarriage and everything like that, that's enough to have someone be like, you know what, forget it. We're just going back. I'm going to go back to what I know. But for some reason, you chose to stay and you saw something bigger for yourself. And in the process, you learned you were resilient. And that you found a way to cope, to adapt, and it's changed how you see things. So I think that's so impressive, and I'm being inspired just as I talk to you, honestly. And so what, if any advice you may have for, let's say, an EM doc who may be considering moving abroad? I think being resilient or finding ways to adapt are huge. I mean, I think that is a skill that I think you do develop when you move abroad. But any advice you have for someone who is considering moving abroad?
I think one kind of mantra that I have for myself and for my partner is, when we're facing challenges, I just frequently remind myself, I'm not the first person to do this. So, we've been through a lot of challenges. Like, I'm not the first person to go through all these things individually or collectively. Like, surely someone else has been in this situation. And in some ways, there's comfort in that. So when people tell me, oh, I wish I could move abroad, I just can't though, the kids and the house and stuff. And I don't want to undermine their feelings, so I don't say it out loud, but my thought is, you wouldn't be the first person that did it though, so it's not like you're treading completely new ground. It's new ground to you, but there's going to be a way to do it, and someone has blazed that path before, and you just got to find out you got to find the path, I guess. And so kind of the advice that, like, as weird as it sounds and as like jarring as it might be to your entire world, there are people that do it. So it is doable. It's not like for you to just say, oh, I could never. That's actually just not true. Like, people do it. But it's just a matter of what's important to you in this finite amount of time, that we have. And so if it's important to you to keep kind of a certain degree of stability and like certain things that you value, do that. But if it's important to you to go explore another country and to try that, you're not the first person to do it. In fact, like, even Hippocratic Adventures, like, think like there's resources, like, reach out, and then you'll find out it's actually way more doable than you just sitting here thinking about all the obstacles. Like, someone's gone through those and can tell you, maybe give you some advice. It'll be your own unique path, obviously, but there's just too many examples of success stories for that to hold you back.
That is excellent advice, because I think that's such a common experience of like, oh, I could never do that. And I think it just comes down to like, look, what are your priorities? What does an awesome life look like to you? What do you want to do now? And for a lot of people, they don't have this dream of moving abroad. It's just not something that attracts them, that interests them. But I would say that exactly for the people that do, there is a way. And I think that's the whole point of Hippocratic Adventures, is really to show you that you have options, and that people like Erika, they're blazing that way. They're showing you how to do it, and that you can do it. So I love that. I think that's awesome piece of advice. And the last rapid fire questions, these weren't so rapid, were they? But
I'm sorry,
but it's so important that we talk about this. The last rapid fire question is, what's the coolest place that you've visited since moving to Wales?
So it's not going to be one that you find in all the like tour books or anything. I mean, you'll find it actually in Welsh tour books, like somewhere to visit, but it's not like, oh, while here, I climbed Everest or something. It's not that. It's actually a very local place that made me fall in love with this place to begin with. It is a lake at the base of the national park. It's called Llyn Padarn. And it's just like, it's like the lake you go to swim and to like meet up with people. It's like, after all our overnight shifts, we'll go swim in Padarn. Like, we just jump right in, and it's so picturesque and just so beautiful. There's a slate quarry on one side and the mountains of Snowdonia kind of in the distance, and there's coffee shops in a cute little town and pubs right next to it. And there's people paddleboarding and kayaking all the time. I guess it's sort of like the American equivalent I would think of is like Tahoe, where it's just like this heart of activity in this. And I remember when we came to visit before we moved, we came to visit really briefly just to, I don't know, make sure we knew where Wales was on the map. And when we went and saw Padarn, I was just like, this is where I want to live. Like, I want to live right at the base of this, like on this lake. And we're actually moving there in 3 weeks. We're moving to the town Llanberis, where Padarn is. is like for exactly that reason. So we can just walk down our street and jump in and be at the base of so many hikes and just so many like-minded spirits in one place. I wish I could like hold my phone up and show you photos. It's just a really special kind of gateway to what I would see as like all our outdoor adventures. So
That's awesome. And I'm so happy for you that you're moving there shortly, that you get to be so close to this place that like when you speak about it, your face just lit up. So that is awesome. And to have it be part of kind of your weekly life, your daily life, I think is very cool. So Dr. Erika Kokkinos, thank you so much for sharing your story and being so transparent and open about, the joys and the challenges, and that it wasn't all rainbows and leprechauns. And I don't think we talk about that enough. So thank you so much for sharing that.
of course, thank you so much for having me. Um, I will say that one kind of mindset change that I've experienced here that really gets pushed till the doctors here is using your doctor license and education as a passport.
Mm.
And I think your website and kind of your endeavors, I think, really help open that mindset up to American practitioners. And so I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. And with that, we wrap up another episode of Discovering Where Your White Coat Can Take You. So make sure to like and subscribe because this really helps us reach more physicians who want to move abroad, but honestly don't know how. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What's your biggest insight or aha from this conversation? What resonated with you the most? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're looking to start your own adventure, then you're going to love our free ebook, How to Start Your Adventure. You can head over to hippocraticadventures.com/subscribe right now, where you'll learn the 3 steps to get going.